Okay, today I'd like to talk a little bit about what is called a pedigree. And some of you are familiar with the term pedigree when you think about designer dogs or any kind of organism that has a documented bloodline. They talk about something having a good pedigree. Well, this is a little bit different. When we talk about a pedigree in genetics, we're talking about how an organism passes down traits, the pattern that it passes traits down from generation to generation. And the way that we do a pedigree is we start out drawing a generation of organisms. And so I'm going to say that for our first generation, we are going to have a male and a female have a relationship with one another. The box represents the male, the circle represents the female, the line in between represents that they're going to have offspring. Their first child is going to be a boy. Their second child is a girl. Their third child is a boy. And their last child is also a girl. So they had 4 children in their first generation of offspring. We're going to pretend like this lady or this girl has married somebody, and now they are having a child. And we'll say that their first child was a daughter, and then they had a son. And we'll say that this man married or had relations with somebody, shall we say, and they had a daughter. They also had a son. So let's use this and see if we can figure out how some traits, and by the way, this is the third generation, so their grandchildren, this male and female, their grandchildren are here. They have 4 grandchildren. So how can we trace, we'll say, a recessive disorder? Now we know that when something's recessive, in order to get that trait or get that disease in this particular case, you have to have 2 recessive alleles. The way that you show that somebody carries a disease, so to speak, is by shading them in halfway. So we're going to say that this lady and this man are both carriers for a disease. The disease I'm going to pick is called cystic fibrosis. And I'm not just making this up because this actually is a recessive disease. So since both of them are carriers for the disease, and cystic fibrosis is a recessive disease, or disorder, shall we say, I'm going to write down their genotypes as big C, little c, big C, little c. Now, if we did a Punnett square for these two, you would see that they have a 1 in 4 chance of having a baby that has cystic fibrosis, a 50% chance of having carriers. Since they did have 4 kids, we'll go ahead and say that this firstborn, that he actually has cystic fibrosis. We'll say she is a carrier, since it is a 50% chance. We'll say that he is normal, and we'll say that she is also a carrier. So that kind of fits exactly with what the Punnett square said would happen. At the minimum, these children down here have to be carriers because this guy is little c, little c. He has nothing to give his offspring except for a recessive C. So I'm going to go ahead and shade them in halfway. I'm going to go ahead and shade him in halfway. And over here, if we were to do a Punnett square, and this guy is normal, that Punnett square would look like this. She, whoops, let me get this over here. She is going to be big C, little c, and he is big C because he's normal. If you look at this, what's going to end up happening is they don't have a chance at all of having any children that have cystic fibrosis. But they do have a 50-50 chance of having a carrier, and we'll say that that's going to be him right here. So again, that's only by the odds of it. That doesn't have to work out that way, but that's the way the odds are that that should happen. What you need to be able to do is to look at a pedigree like this and be able to tell that this is recessive inheritance. So what's dominant inheritance then? Let me go ahead and write, we'll do another example here. If recessive means you have to have 2 recessive alleles to have the disorder, a dominant disorder, and here's the first generation, here's the second generation. A dominant disorder just means that if one person has the disease, the way that you get this disease is by having at least one dominant allele. So we're going to make him big H, little h, and she's normal. She's little h. I'm actually doing this for a real disease that is called Huntington's disease. Now, if he's big H, little h, and she's little h, if we did a Punnett square for these two, you would see that 50% of the children are at risk of having Huntington's. All he has to do is give that big H to one of the children, and they're going to have the disease. So we're going to go ahead and shade in. He ends up getting Huntington's disease, and we'll say that she also ends up getting Huntington's disease. So this person right here is little h, this person here is little h, and this person is little h. So these are two ways. This one up top is recessive. Oops, this one up top is recessive. The one on the bottom is dominant. If you'll notice, there's no such thing as being a carrier for a dominant disease. You can't carry it. If you have the dominant allele, you are going to have the disease. We can also do a pedigree for a sex-linked disorder. And I'll do one for myself. This was my grandmother. This was my grandfather. Here they had my Uncle John. They had my mother, Connie. Connie married my father, Raleigh. There he is. And then they had my sister, and they had me. Now, my grandmother was colorblind. So what that means is that we're going to completely shade her in because she was colorblind. If you recall, colorblindness is an X-linked recessive disease. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show that she has two bad X's by putting a little C on each one of those X's. She had to give my mother a bad X. And so my mom was a carrier for colorblindness. So she was X big C, X little c. My dad had normal color vision. My mother then had a 50-50 chance of giving me that bad X chromosome. And indeed she did. Now males, here's me, I've got the bad X and a Y. I have no X chromosome to cover that up, and so there's no such thing as being a carrier for a male. And so there's me with color blindness. So this is a X-linked recessive pedigree.